So I'm sitting here with Dr. Matthew Geras, who is a professor of political science here at the University of Illinois Springfield. And today we are talking about the shift that we are seeing within the Republican Party, as well as the congressional Republicans, specifically in the House. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Geras.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, I just wanted to get into this as cleanly as possible and keep it as simple as possible. So as you know, there has been an increased shift within the Republican Party towards Donald Trump and his style of politics, whether it's people like Paul Gosar or Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. These figures have, to some extent, embraced the attack rhetoric that was a staple of Donald Trump's campaign styles in 2016 and 2020. And I was wondering, first of all, how does that affect the dynamics within the Republican Party, both with the traditionalists and with the Trumpists, but also what does it mean for the Republican Party and the political system as a whole?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, some of these more and more Republicans, both in Congress and outside of Congress, are embracing these tactics because Trump is still very popular among Republican voters. And in fact, Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was fraudulent and stolen are also pretty widely supported and by Republican majorities, but by Republican voters. So it obviously varies by survey and exactly how the questions are worded, but an increasing number of Republicans to some degree support the claim that the 2020 election was fraudulent and are less trusting of our elections. So because we see these views in the general public, in large part because Trump continually makes these false claims, we see other Republicans going along with it as well, whether they actually believe it or not. Sometimes it's just a strategic decision that if they want to have a future in the Republican Party, they need to side with Donald Trump.
And so to further add to that, it's so almost as if there's a certain element of the party in chief legitimizing conspiracy theories in a way that not only allows Republicans to avoid necessarily substantiating their claims, but also castigating substantiation itself as an attack on their politics. Would you say that with Donald Trump and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene in particular, we are seeing not only the rejection of, how would I say this, the burden of proof in a way, or would you say that it's partially a form of grievance politics, or both?
I think it's some of both. I think some of it just relates to this idea of what we call nationalized elections or nationalized politics, which is essentially the idea that what happens at the national stage has a down ballot effect on like even local and state elections. And related to that is the concept of negative partisanship, which is the idea that most Democrats dislike the Republican Party more than they actually like the Democratic Party. And we see the same trend among Republican voters, that most Republican voters dislike the Democratic Party more than they actually like the Republican Party. And when this is such a wide sweeping and growing trend in the electorate, it allows elected officials to kind of take these extreme viewpoints and sometimes even conspiratorial viewpoints, because they know that they won't necessarily lose their base because their base dislikes the other party. And of course, we know that oftentimes elites drive polarization and contribute to polarization, that when they announce a viewpoint or hold a viewpoint, that many voters will follow.
So it's sort of like red meat to the base. You don't necessarily have to argue for a specific policy. You just have to hate the same people. And I remember studying that as well when I was getting my political science degree at Loras. Recently, actually, there was an incident in Downers Grove that was kind of an example of this. The Proud Boys, which is nationally known as like a very far-right organization, has also played a role in school board meetings and things like that and cause trouble there. But to further add to that question of how these figures, specifically Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress, play a role within the Republican Party. I was wondering if you thought of the way in which her financial role has influenced the rhetoric of the Republican Party. Between 2019 and 2020, Marjorie Taylor Greene raised somewhere around $3 million, according to the Federal Election Commission. And she has promised $175,000 to the Republican National Committee, specifically to help win more seats for the Republican Party. Despite the dangers that traditional Republicans like Mitch McConnell have brought up, with her being referred to as a cancer by the minority leader, do you think that that financial angle allows her to stay afloat within the Republican Party, even as she receives opposition from within it?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem lies in that the opposition within the party is becoming smaller and smaller, at least within Congress, where we saw many Republicans who opposed Donald Trump or who voted to impeach Donald Trump have retired or aren't seeking re-election. And when they leave their formal institutional role, that makes the individuals who support Trump and support these conspiracy theories more prominent within the party. And we actually saw an example of this last week where, as you mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene actually lost her committee assignments in Congress, and so did Paul Gosar, which is another member that you mentioned. And Kevin McCarthy last week gave a speech on the House floor that said basically if the Republican Party retakes control of Congress and if he's elected Speaker next year, he would probably not only give back their committee assignments, but he might even actually elevate them to more important committees. So I think to some extent we're seeing that there's less and less resistance to these ideas, at least within the institution of Congress. And I'm not saying that's universal. We see individuals like Adam Kinzinger and others speaking out against these elected officials, including Liz Cheney. But we see these individuals like losing positions of power within the institution, within the party. So Liz Cheney, who in terms of policy is a very conservative Republican, but she effectively lost her leadership position because she was voted in favor of impeaching Trump. And same thing, Adam Kinzinger, he's seen as a more moderate Republican, but he again is retiring from office. He's not going to seek re-election, in part due to redistricting. But again, his voice of opposition is no longer going to be in Congress next year.
And it kind of goes back to this idea, and I think it was Professor Jason Stanley who made this point at Yale, is a lot of this rhetoric gives the veneer of authenticity because it destroys some of the political norms that many people just see as corrupt politicians lying and whatnot. Given that kind of veneer that defends this kind of rhetoric and the faltering state of the anti-Trump opposition within the Republican Party, is there a way for the American political process to restrain this form of rhetoric, or is it just going to become a continuing stream in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I think this is a really difficult question to answer, and I don't know that I have a very clear answer for you, but I think when we get to the point that, particularly in relation to the big lie, I think it's very concerning that we're at a point where large portions of the general public can no longer trust our electoral systems, and that raises questions of how much longer we can continue to have elections where the results are going to be accepted, and that has implications for democratic backsliding and how often we can view ourselves as a democracy. And I think a lot of us like to think that Trump and his style of politics was a blip on the radar and that it will eventually go away. But I think we're seeing signs that that's not necessarily the case.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because Donald Trump himself is popular within the Republican Party, but he was never necessarily popular within America, generally speaking. 538's examination of average polling notes that he never reached an average polling rate above 50%. So to some extent, I wonder how much of this investment in Trumpist rhetoric is a short-term attempt to gain power within the Republican Party, but simultaneously alienating themselves from the rest of society. Do you think that there's a risk for the Republicans by holding on to this strategy, or is appealing to the base enough to keep them floating for the next couple decades?
Yeah, so it's again, it's an interesting question. Um, we kind of we've kind of seen in the Virginia and New Jersey elections that just this past year. Now, Trump wasn't on the ballot in those elections, and in some cases, the candidates on the ballots tried to, like the Republican candidates on the ballot, tried to distance themselves from Trump to some extent. But we kind of saw that like our national trend of just one party gaining power. So we elected Joe Biden president, and then it's just kind of a natural trend where like the Democratic parties are expected to have a backlash and lose support and lose ground in Congress in the midterm elections. And we kind of see evidence that maybe these trends will continue, and that again, like Trump is not necessarily enough of an anomaly to change that. I think the Democrats are banking on the fact that, like, again, if Trump is on the ballot in 2024, and they're going to try and make, to some extent, the 2022 midterms against, like, look, you need to continue to elect Democrats to prevent Trump from rising to power again. But it's unclear whether that strategy is going to work if these first few election cycles are an indication that this strategy is going to be enough to overturn just the cyclical trends we normally see in election cycles.
And I would just also like to add to another point of this is the rhetoric that other members of Congress, not just Marjorie Taylor Greene or former President Trump, but people like Lauren Boebert, who, as you are likely aware, there was an incident where she referred to Ilhan Omar as a member of the Jihad Squad. Now, considering in the past religious bigotry, whether it was anti-Catholic bigotry with the nativist parties, or just general antipathy towards the Muslim people in the United States, have played a significant role historically in our understanding of electoral politics and sometimes influenced acts of violence. But Lauren Boebert also sits in a district that has increasingly been somewhat oppositional to the Republican Party. For example, her district, her predecessor just 2 election cycles ago won that district by 14 points, but she only won it by 5, and that same predecessor also saw a decline in his support. So as districts like hers diversify and become more connected rather than just one ethnic group controlling it, do you think that rhetoric will kind of backfire on the Republican Party and by extension Boebert herself? Or do you think that appealing to these bases will be enough to protect them from that kind of demographic shift?
Yeah. So again, some of it depends on who controls redistricting, of how safe individual members will be in the upcoming election cycle. And this is true of every time we have redistricting, that like when the Democrats control a state legislature, they want to draw Democratic districts, and vice versa. When Republicans control a state legislature, they want to draw more Republican districts. So that's like kind of how we can see it more broadly. But yeah, I think generally the conventional wisdom is that as the country continues to diversify, this type of rhetoric will be out of step, and the Republican Party, if it continues to embrace this rhetoric, will be out of step and eventually see their margin of, or their ability to win elections will decrease. If the current trends of minority voters, particularly Black voters, being more likely to support Democrats continues. And going back to prior to the arrival of Donald Trump, the Republican Party, as after the 2012 election, when Mitt Romney failed to defeat Obama when he sought re-election, one of the lessons that the Republican Party took from the 2012 election was that they had to do a better job with minority and Latino voters. And they had like a campaign autopsy, and that was one of their findings or inclusions or conclusions or goals for the future. And then that kind of got put on the back burner with the emergence of Trump.
Yeah, and kind of to push on that element as well, I do sometimes see a lot of discussion surrounding the idea of diversity necessarily being oppositional to the Republican Party. But I do sometimes wonder what role redistricting will play in that. So if you've got the Republican Party, for the most part, they have control of most of the legislatures and the governorships, and that means they have a lot more control over the demographics in voting. So if Republicans continue to hold on to the legislatures, do you think they can kind of avoid, or at the very least mitigate, that kind of shift, or will it just become so overwhelming that no amount of shifts in redistricting will matter?
What point I wanted to add to my previous answer that I didn't mention is that um, in the past couple of election cycles where the Republican Party has been successful, it's when they've run more diverse candidates. So I think in 2018 and in 2020, where the seats that the Republicans have picked up have been in districts where we see more Republican women running for office and more ethnic and racial minority Republicans run for office, and similarly where we see veterans run for office. So I think that while we traditionally think of this increasing descriptive representation as being a goal of the Democratic Party opposed to the Republican Party, we have seen more diverse Republican candidates be successful, and that can play into this relationship as well.
So it might not necessarily mean that they have to redistrict their way out of it, but not just run more diverse candidates without actually saying that they're listening to the diverse change that they've kind of been dealing with for the last couple of years. And one final question before you go, I just want to kind of hit on that note you mentioned earlier about how the Republicans might put people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert back into positions of higher power, and Paul Gosar as well. If the Republican Party, which they likely will, takes the House and possibly the Senate, what can we expect from Republican-controlled legislative branches, and what can we expect to see from their policy-wise and also their rhetoric, if you had to guess?
Yeah, so I'll actually speak to like institutional control. As I mentioned, Kevin McCarthy's speech last week. Part of the reason he gave that speech is he's trying to shore up his chance of winning Speaker of the House, because he sees that that's the direction the Republican Party is taking. In terms of what Congress will do, I think we'll expect to see a lot of gridlock, because Joe Biden will still be president. And if the Republican Party passes partisan policies that the Democratic Party doesn't support, you can expect him to veto a lot of those legislative proposals. And overriding a veto is very difficult in our system.
So basically, we're going to see a lot of stagnation and a lot of anger, but not necessarily a lot of policy.
Yeah, and that kind of seems to be the cycle. We, again, going back to the cyclical cycles we see in our national politics and our national elections, that kind of seems to be the trend where a new president comes to power. They have unified control of government for like a very short period of time. Normally, it's just 2 years. They lose at least partial control of Congress during the midterm elections, and then we have this period of gridlock, and then eventually the cycle will repeat itself.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining me. It was very, very illustrative of what I've been kind of trying to figure out as well, and how to balance traditional political analysis and polling versus the more crazed elements of our politics. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.